So welcome, everyone. My name is Lori Osborne, and I'm the director of the Frances Willard House Museum. This program tonight is part of our Views on Women's History series, which examines topics in women's history with new eyes. We are excited to bring them to you via Zoom, so we can reach so many people and have speakers who may not live nearby, including Andrea tonight. This year, our theme for this series is Knowledge is Power, Women and Education. And we are discussing how important education was to women, especially in the early years of the 19th century, when so much was changing. Our speaker today will be helping us see this time period more clearly. Her book on the subject was really instrumental in our storytelling, and it was from her book that we began to have a fuller understanding of the Evanston story, and especially some of the early Evanston women who were forceful in their advocacy of women's education. The Frances Willard House Museum is the home of Frances Willard, 19th century suffragist and social reformer. You can find out more about her home, Willard, and the WCTU on our website, franceswillardhouse.org. We're open for tours in the house and research in the archives, and we welcome your visit both in Evanston and online, where we have lots on our website about our stories. If you don't already get our newsletter, be sure to go to our website and sign up and follow us on social media. You can make a donation on the website to support our work and this talk if you would like to. This program year, all our programs will remain free, but we are encouraging those who are able to make a donation today, and a link will be posted in chat. A little bit of housekeeping. In order for us to create a video of this event for posting later, we have muted everyone and turned off video feeds. We'll have about 40 minutes of presentation and conversation, and then time for some questions. We ask that you use the chat for questions, and you can submit them as the talk goes along. Fiona Maxwell, Museum Operations Manager, will be monitoring the chat and will share your questions when we get to that time. We will be sharing the video later via our YouTube channel if you want to watch it again or let others know. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker. Dr. Andrea L. Turpin is Associate Professor and Graduate Program Director of History at Baylor University. Her first prize-winning book, A New Moral Vision, Gender, Religion, and the Changing Purposes of American Higher Education, 1837 to 1917, which was published by Cornell University Press in 2016, explores how the entrance of women into U.S. colleges and universities shaped changing ideas about the moral and religious purposes of higher education, and in turn, profoundly shaped American culture. Dr. Turpin is currently on research leave for 2023. She's writing her second book project, which positions women as key players in the narrative of the Protestant fundamentalist-modernist controversy of the early 20th century. The split between theological and social liberals and conservatives, which many credit with giving birth to the modern culture wars. And we're really excited to have you here tonight, Andrea. I'll let you take it away, and I'll be back when you're done with your presentation.
All right, I'm going to practice the share screen thing, and we'll see if this works. All right, let's do this. Actually, if I go here, that should work. Share. All right, can you see it correctly?
Looks good.
Wonderful. Okay, so welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you have come to hear a little bit about the start of women's higher education here in the United States. So I want to start us off. So here we have a picture of my institution, Baylor, which was possibly founded co-ed in 1845. The records are actually a little bit tricky as to whether women and men actually took classes together from the very beginning, but eventually certainly became coeducational. So I throw it up there for that context. So I want to start off here with actually one of my favorite slides when I'm teaching about women's higher education, and it's this slide. So here on the left, we have a picture of Holder Hall at Princeton University, and here on the right, a picture of Bryn Mawr College, one of the main buildings there. Princeton, one of the oldest universities in the United States, founded in 1746. all male until the late 1960s. Bryn Mawr, an early women's college founded in 1884. And so when you're looking at the architecture here, what you would assume is happening, right, is that the new upstart women's college is copying the architecture of the established, venerable Ivy League men's institution. But that's not what's happening. What's actually happening here is that Bryn Mawr, in a bid to establish itself in its reputation as a high academic institution, and it very genuinely was, patterned itself off of Oxford and Cambridge in England and brought in an architect to do this sort of modern Gothic thing. Bryn Mawr is only about an hour from Princeton. Princeton saw the building and called the architect. And Princeton actually copied Bryn Mawr. So women's higher education is full of surprises. And one of the surprises that I want to talk about today is that the very first sort of permanent higher education for American women in a single-sex setting and in a coeducational setting was because of people of faith and their religious convictions. And that runs against some of our contemporary stereotypes of women being sometimes limited by American religious traditions of various sorts. And that stereotype exists for a reason. There are traditions that do that. But there are traditions that don't, both now and in the past. And so that's what I want to give the background story to, and how those traditions sort of launched women's higher education here in the United States. All right, so when I teach women's higher ed, one of the things, and when I teach women's suffrage, one of the things I have to talk about with students is, okay, well, why didn't it exist? Because it's second nature to us. Well, of course women should vote. Of course women should go to college. Well, why didn't they originally? So why didn't they originally is because, frankly, few men went to college either, right? So men were going to college in very small numbers, 1% to 2% of the American population. And they were doing it if they had like one of four goals: to be a lawyer, to be a minister, to be a doctor, or to be a cultured gentleman, someone who was part of the international community of letters. So what this means is that they would go to college and they would have a very set curriculum. So they would study Latin and Greek, math, philosophy, moral philosophy, so ethics, and like they would do just that. That was college. So after the founding of the United States, and that was the colonial period. After the founding of the United States, this curriculum continued on, but increasingly there was a groundswell of interest in women getting higher education too, but it didn't quite mean college. It was often known as women's seminaries or academies. Now, a seminary to us is a theological seminary. That's our colloquial term for it now, but it really just means a 3-year institution. Fun fact, if you get a Master's of Divinity degree, it takes you 3 years. So that's where we get the seminary name here, also known as academies. And it was sort of like upper level high school, lower college level. So that was the first highest education available to American women beyond a sort of reading, writing, arithmetic level. And it happened for several reasons after the founding of the United States. The first was this ideology known as Republican motherhood, which is to say, shoot, we've never tried democracy on this scale before, so it's probably good that we have all hands on deck, so women should probably help out. And they can help out by educating their children, and particularly their sons, to be thoughtful citizens and moral citizens, because they're going to be voters. So we need to make sure they're good at that. And that means that mothers too needed an education, and even single women needed an education because they would often fill the growing common schools. Public education seemed like a good idea if everyone's going to vote. Then when you get to about the 1820s, you see this phenomenon really take off. And that's connected to the rise of what's known as the market revolution, commercialization, businesses moving off of people's farms and into a city. So men left, they conducted business over there. It made the economy kind of volatile. And parents wanted their daughters to have a skill in case they couldn't support them and in case they weren't married yet. And so often that was teaching. So daughters would get higher education to be able to teach. And it was considered appropriate because there was a real hardening of an understanding of what's appropriate for men and what's appropriate for women when men left the farm and went over there, and women kind of stayed on the household and raised kids. There had been much more of a blend in the colonial period when everybody helped out on the farm. It's important to know that one of the reasons that higher education for women arose is that women wanted it, right? Self-improvement. When opportunities presented themselves, women took it, and women pioneered in providing opportunities for themselves and others. And the final one is the one that we can forget about. And that's what I want to talk about today, which is that in an era when women were not permitted to be ministers, but many women in the United States were Christians, and particularly evangelical Protestants at the time. They wanted a role in spreading the Christian message and doing something for the church. And one of the things they could do, this is before, we'd be horrified now in a public school setting that they were doing this in schooling settings, but they were able to sort of act like ministers and teach about Christianity in a schooling setting with children. And so they would also have religious motivations for training themselves to be teachers. All right, so the reason that you get a couple of people, a few groups pushing above this level for women's education, above the seminary academy level, is actually that they had a very specific type of religious conviction that I label evangelical pragmatism. And so what this means is, this is not technical American pragmatism, which dates to the late 19th century, but they were just really pragmatic about getting the Christian message out. And what that meant is that they wanted to educate as many people as possible, both men and women, rich and poor, and in some cases, Black and white. And we'll talk more about that. As cheaply as possible, because that lets you educate more, right? As high as possible, give them the best possible training to go out and do whatever God might have for them and be able to spread the Christian message, and also in being able to bring about what they call the kingdom of God on earth, which meant a sort of golden age of morality. And so they would be interested both in preaching and conversion, but also in social reform. And so some of the pioneers of women's higher education were interested in training women to participate in the things that Willard would later be part of in terms of spreading women's civic participation, particularly advocating for temperance, and before the Civil War, advocating for abolition. So evangelical pragmatism, interestingly, underlay the first sort of almost collegiate level permanent higher education for women in a single sex setting, Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, later college, founded in 1837, and the first truly coeducational college, best I can figure out in the world, Oberlin Collegiate Institute, later Oberlin College, founded in 1833, biracial 1835, and coeducational 1837. And let me just stop and talk about how radical that is for a sec. Oberlin pioneered in truly coeducational level college education for both men and women in a biracial setting. It's the first person to ever do it, and it did it in a setting that admitted both Black and white students at a time period in the 1830s when there was widespread concern and fear over what was known as miscegenation, or the intermarriage of Black and white people. So the only thing that could make something like that viable was this evangelical pragmatism motivation that we are just going to educate everybody, rich, poor, Black, white, male, female, as cheaply as possible, which means in one institution, as well as possible, to get more hands on deck for God, both in terms of spreading the Christian message and in terms of enabling social reform. So I want to pull back and talk a little bit about the stories of each of these two places. First, we have Mount Holyoke. So we've got here a drawing or rendering of the original campus of Mount Holyoke, founded in Massachusetts in South Hadley in 1837. And you can see on the right hand of your screen, a really big building. And so Mary Lyon, who is the founder of Mount Holyoke, there's pictures of her here, which I'll talk about in a minute, got everybody in one building for sort of maximum cheapness, maximum efficiency, and they would all learn dominantly in that big building. So I've got you two pictures of Mary Lyon, the founder, here, and I'll talk more about her in just a sec, but I wanted to flag this. The top picture is what's known as a daguerreotype. It's an early photograph. Photographic technology, as those of you who are 19th century historians know, in the 19th century required you to be very still because it required a long exposure time. So no one smiled because you can't hold it. It would blur the photograph. So she looks really dour here. And that is not what she was like at all. She was happy and scatterbrained by all reports, in sort of like a woo sort of way. And so this drawing in the lower left-hand corner of her a little bit younger captures a little bit more of that. It's colored according to the descriptions of sort of her coloring at the time. And she went through a turban phase. It was a thing. Okay, so a little bit more about Mary Lyon. How did she end up founding a seminary? And so context, there were women's seminaries and academies, rising and during the 1820s, but they would be founded by a particular founder like Mary Lyon, who was the principal. So when we talk about a school principal, it originally meant principal teacher, like the head teacher, the founder. But when that teacher got married, moved away, the school would just collapse. It wasn't permanent. Lyon had the vision to get an endowment and a board and make a school that would outlast her. And obviously she succeeded because Mount Holyoke still exists today. And this is the first time anyone ever did that for a women's institution. And Mount Holyoke was the top best available education for women in a single sex setting. It would go on to add a fourth year and go on to actually become a college in the 1880s officially. So what would motivate her to do this? She grew up in rural Massachusetts. Father died young, mother held the farm together. She had great faith in sort of the common people as a result of this sort of marginal economic upbringing. She grew up in a Baptist setting, later experienced evangelical conversion as a young woman, and because of the people she was with and the setting she was with, became a Congregationalist at that time. What got the best education that was available to her because she had an active mind and just an interest in this. Was part of a lot of these little schools and academies that weren't permanent, and then had this vision that she wanted to make a women's institution, and what she wanted it to do was be permanent so it could continue to serve God into the future. And she also wanted it to be affordable, because many of the women's institutions at the time would target the middle to upper middle class, even rich women, on the theory that those are going to be the most influential members of society. So if you have limited resources, you're going to expand education to some women at a really high level. Let's make it rich women. Also, they can afford it, right? To run a private school, you've got to have money, as any of us funding or benefiting from private school today know. And so she came up with a way, very creatively, to make it the best education possible and cheaper. And again, this was motivated by evangelical pragmatism. Let's get as many people as possible with this kind of education. So she decided that instead of the standard women's academy approach, where you have a lot of the liberal arts taught, but also some sort of professional female tasks formally taught in the classroom, like sewing or like homemaking, that would have economic benefit for the students. She's like, no, we're only going to do the liberal arts education, and filling that. We're going to do it every 3 years. We're going to make sure you actually have to graduate year 1 to go to year 2 instead of just taking classes here and there, as was not uncommon in women's academies. So as high as possible by kicking out some of the technical training, but everyone who attended Mount Holyoke had to do chores, like for 4 hours a day worth of chores on a rotating basis. They did the cleaning, they did the cooking. And she marketed this to parents who were worried about sending off their kids as, your kids will be fine. They'll keep their domestic skills in play. They'll still be able to get married, right? Because they know how to keep house. But that's not why she was doing it. She was doing it to drive down the price, because then you don't have to hire a maid staff or a cook. You just have the students do it. She also paid her teachers next to nothing. So I want to point this out to say, people in the past are complex figures. She wasn't necessarily trying to make women's work more prestigious. She was trying to expand women's opportunities. And so she got missionary-minded teachers who were willing to be paid less in order to accomplish this goal because of their religious faith, that they believed it was important for people to follow Jesus. They wanted to train women to be a part of that, so there would be more people spreading that message, both in the American West and abroad. And Mount Holyoke was wildly successful at this. The majority of its students became teachers in the American West. The vast, vast majority of them became Christians, even if they weren't when they entered the institution, because it was a highly religious environment. And 178 Mount Holyoke graduates 50 years later had become foreign missionaries, who typically were missionaries to women. They would establish little daughter schools of Mount Holyoke in foreign countries where the populace was not Christian, and seek to both provide women's education that had not been previously available and to convert the populace to Christianity. So going forward with this, let's talk about Oberlin. So it actually gave an even higher level of education to women in 1837. And I want to flag here that Oberlin was founded by men. And so shout out to men who cared about women's higher education too. So founded in 1833 by a pair of Presbyterians, John Shifford and Philo Stewart. And I'll talk about Charles Finney in a sec. And those of you who are familiar with 19th century history, you'll know that there was a whole wave of communitarian experiments going on at the time. Like, let's try to create the perfect world in miniature. And Oberlin sort of partook of this. Shifford and Stewart had this idea, well, let's create this little perfect Christian colony that will show people how it's done, throw back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the ideal of the city on a hill. Let's show people how the Christian community is supposed to work, and then maybe other people will copy us. But Shifford and Stewart did something really interesting. They turned Oberlin, the town, into what I refer to as a sending city on a hill, which is to say they didn't just make a community, they founded a college in the community, so that they would pass on the values to people in the college who would go and be ministers or teachers and spread those values. And their values were sort of what you might call, radical Christian values for the time. They believed in living simply. They, ate simply. They didn't buy a lot of fancy clothes. They were involved in every moral reform movement under the sun: abolitionism, temperance, anti-prostitution advocacy, certain beliefs, interestingly, about like your diet and becoming a better person through eating. I mean, they were very experimental. Some of them were perfectionists. They believed you could actually become perfect in this life. And they passed these values on to students. Like Mount Holyoke, Oberlin was a highly religious environment, and students attended rounds of prayer meetings and rounds of reform meetings. And again, remember, it's biracial and coeducational. So it's Black and white, male and female students all doing this together. Some women took a lower sort of track that wasn't fully collegiate, but some women were admitted to the full collegiate track starting in 1837. Charles Finney, the man whose picture is up here, is a famous 19th century revivalist, as many of you know, and he agreed to come to Oberlin as its theology professor, and he'd later go on to be the president, on the condition, right, that Oberlin was going to go biracial. And so at the time, Shifford was trying to convince the board, and he said this. I think this is kind of fun. So he said, we should do this. We should integrate the school. This should be passed because, quote, it is right principle and God will bless us in doing right. Also because thus doing right, we gain the confidence of benevolent and able men who will probably furnish us some thousands. And so pragmatic and idealistic. The benevolent and able men were people like Finney, who would draw funding to the school by being famous. And also this pair of really famous reforming brothers who were super rich, Lewis and Arthur Tappan, agreed to give a huge donation to the school if they would admit Black students alongside white students. So Oberlin graduates, like Mount Holyoke graduates, also went and did a wide variety of things that the founders had envisioned, oftentimes spreading the Christian message as missionaries or teachers. Oberlin graduates, at account of it being a little bit of a different vibe kind of school, would also go on to be things like abolitionists and feminists. Lucy Stone is a famous Oberlin graduate who did both of those things, one of the first famous women not to change her last name when she married, also heavily involved in the American Women's, NASA, AWSA, the American Women's Suffrage Association, which was trying to gain suffrage for American women state by state. So, and she partnered with Frederick Douglass famously to do this. So these were wildly successful institutions. And as they relate to the story of someone like Frances Willard and laying the groundwork here, Mount Holyoke convinced the watching world that you could have women's higher education at the same level as men, and women wouldn't become unfeminine in the way that people were afraid of, because Mount Holyoke, kept their domestic skills in play in their extracurricular time. And so you see that sort of pattern followed in the initial women's schools, which later then dropped that. But the Seven Sisters, the great Eastern women's colleges, Vassar patterned itself after Mount Holyoke. Wellesley patterned itself particularly closely after Mount Holyoke. We also see echoes of this at Smith and Bryn Mawr. Meanwhile, Oberlin, as a coeducational institution, proved that it could be done, and the Midwest adopted coeducation. So we'll get to Northwestern here in a sec, but interestingly enough, what became Hillsdale was the second institution in the Midwest to adopt it. It was originally founded by Free Methodists. Free Will Baptists. And they thought this sounded like a good idea for evangelical pragmatism reasons. And then Antioch, under Horace Mann, the great common school reformer, they were Unitarians. They also thought it sounded like a good idea for different reasons. University of Iowa, the first state institution to adopt coeducation in 1855. And famously, the University of Michigan, one of the great state universities that would ultimately become a leading research university, toyed with the idea in 1858, which was very early, looked at Oberlin and ultimately decided, we can't put in the right kind of precautions to make sure we don't have scandal. We're not going to do it. And that this was under a president who was hesitant about women's education. Erastus Haven was a later president of the University of Michigan, who in the years that he was president, 1863 to 1869, moved the institution in the direction of changing its mind so that Michigan actually went co-ed in 1870. Then he moved to Northwestern, right? And was instrumental in pioneering coeducation there. Northwestern would merge the Evanston College for Ladies, where Frances Willard was president, and go coeducational, and she would become its dean of women for a year before having conflicts with the administration and withdrawing to focus on the WCTU. But Oberlin was the direct pattern from Michigan. Haven came from Michigan to Northwestern and was instrumental in facilitating coeducation there. So there's like a really direct chain. And of course, Northwestern, we saw Baptists and Congregationalists and Presbyterians. Northwestern was Methodist, and Haven and Willard both were as well. So you're seeing these kinds of themes playing out among a number of Protestant denominations. It's not everybody in those denominations. Let me be very, very clear. It's a subset of people who are taking a particular mind about having the goal of spreading the Christian message and what they consider to be Christian civilization and reform, trumping what they consider to be merely cultural beliefs about men and women. And here I want to end on a quote from Mary Lyon, who had gone and done some controversial things. She would go traveling by herself to raise money for Mount Holyoke, and people were like, that is not done. That is not feminine. And this is what she said. What do I do that is wrong? I ride in the stagecoach or cars without an escort. Other ladies do the same. I visit a family where I've been previously invited, and the minister's wife or some leading woman calls the ladies together to see me, and I lay our object before them. Is that wrong? I go with Mr. Hawks, who's the agent, and call on a gentleman of known liberality at his own house and converse with him about our enterprise. What harm is there in that? My heart is sick, my soul is pained with this empty gentility, this genteel nothingness. I am doing a great work, I cannot come down. That last quote, I am doing a great work, I cannot come down. It is from the book of Nehemiah in the Bible. It's referring to the man who was in charge of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem after the people of God, the Israelites, had been in captivity and had come back to their homeland. And so she is identifying herself with a historic man of God who's saying, I can't take these distractions of people who are not of goodwill. They're trying to, put the culture, the customs of people above the ultimate will of God. And so this sort of an attitude of certain people of faith, and particularly the group I refer to as evangelical pragmatists, underlay this push to the highest initial level of women's education. The story will go on, and my book tells the story of the rest of that through the 1920s, and there are various twists and turns, but I wanted to set us up and bring us to the time of Willard and Northwestern, and I'll end there and open for questions.
Thank you so much, Andrea. It's so interesting to see the ground being in the period. I'm fascinated by this idea of women's role in making this education happen, because we see that in Evanston, really, these early women, they're really faculty wives, people coming to start Northwestern, and they're bringing, like Mary, these different points of view on how women should be educated, why it's important. They've had a little bit of education in those seminaries, some of them. So they've had some experience, and they're wanting to make it a reality when they get to Evanston. So I can see the patterns playing out that you so well describe. I'm also really curious, because this is something that we see in Willard's life and Willard's work, which comes later than the story, this idea of balancing this traditional, sort of very traditional, what we would see as very traditional. Anything to do with Christianity and religion sounds very traditional to us with our ears today. But that very traditional approach with much more sort of radical thinking, and that idea that we can do both of those things. Women can be educated and not outside their traditional role, and how we balance that. If you could talk a little bit more about that kind of struggle and how we can see it from our 21st century, with our 21st century eyes, understand it a little better.
So one of the things that I point out briefly in the book is that when you're looking at the Christian scriptures as people were, for the vast majority of human history, they're actually advocating more equality for women than would be true in the surrounding culture, whatever it was. In contemporary the United States, a surface reading of the text, which may not be the intended reading of the original authors, but that's up for debate, right, would indicate that women have less freedom than is true in our contemporary culture. In the 19th century, it's like really kind of that middle point, right? So it just depends on how you read the text and what your tradition is as to whether you understand it to be empowering women to do anything in the name of God and to spread the Christian message, or whether you read it as limiting women's sphere of influence into sort of a separate and different sphere that men's is. So very famously, right, the Grimke sisters wrote defenses of a reading of the scriptures that said, no, women are responsible to God, and anything that God wants us to do, they better do it. And this, so I'm actually arguing that for people like Willard, for people like Lyon, it's not that they felt this conflict or having to keep this balance between keeping their faith and engaging in activism. Their faith was the engine for their activism. That's how they understood the message.
Yeah. And we see that playing out more, and it's so interesting to watch it playing out in this particular area where they are going off to make more Christians too, but they're also doing all this other reform. That's not the only, they're definitely, the concern is that missionary approach, but also all the other things that are happening, especially as we get into the later 19th century.
Yeah, they had a very sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say they had a very holistic vision of what sort of a redeemed world would look like. They believed it looked like individual faith in Christ to sort of be forgiven by God, and the classic message here of reconciled to God through Christ's death, and you have a personal relationship with Christ, but then you follow him to like create the kind of perfect world he was teaching about. And that's where they're engaging in these reforms, and they see these as very connected. But yeah.
They see it and it's very interesting. You really do have to stand in their shoes a little bit and imagine this from, Fiona, do you want to bring up some of the questions from chat? We've got some good conversation going
here. One question that you touched on a little bit, but maybe you could speak more about is the regional approach.
Yes, absolutely.
Specifically, a compare and contrast between the East Coast and the Midwest.
Thank you for that question, whoever asked it. Okay, so yes, there is a fascinating thing going on here regionally. There are, by the time after the Civil War, you end up with 4 types of higher education. You've got independent men's colleges, which the class, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, all that. You've got independent women's colleges, the Seven Sisters, Mount Holyoke and its daughter colleges. You've got coeducational state universities like Michigan, Iowa, Northwestern coeducational private institutions, Cornell coeducational private institution. It's complicated to Cornell. And then you've got coordinate colleges, which is places like Harvard that there's a lot of demand here for women's education, but we really don't want to go co-ed. So we're going to create this separate sideways institution where our professors teach the same classes over here, some of them to women for more money. So there's And a lot of this is absolutely regional. It has to do with where this institution was founded and what they're interpreting their founding purpose to be. So the sort of East Coast are older, literally because that's where the Americans were first, on the East Coast. So they're older. So they understand themselves to have been founded for the leaders of society, whom they understand to be men. Right? The people who can vote until 1920, the East Coast lagged the West in allowing women to vote. The people who are going to be the leading educators and scientists and businessmen. So they think that their institution is supposed to be for leaders, and leaders are supposed to be men, so they don't integrate it. The West, founded by the pioneers who are moving over there, they don't have the buildings already established. They are literally building new institutions, and they're doing it in a different time period when your average person is actually demanding education for their daughters. At a cheap rate, because their daughters may need to provide for themselves. Maybe they won't get married. Maybe they want to be teachers. Heck, maybe they want to do something. We pay taxes. These are state institutions. And so those institutions go co-ed pretty quickly because there's popular demand, and it's just not economically viable to start another institution with tax money. You just have to stick them all in the same place and roll with it. And Oberlin showed it can be done. So everyone's like, okay, great. So it absolutely has to do with where and when it was founded. In the American South, you have a whole lot of things having to do with a different style of traditional culture, and with just devastation from the Civil War, it makes the whole thing lag in terms of establishing new institutions of higher education. And you actually see public institutions staying single sex longer in the South than you do in the Midwest.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. So we've had two questions about Mary Lyon.
Mm-hmm.
One, whether Mary Lyon knew anything about the manual labor college movement, and another one about connections potentially between Mary Lyon and Frances Willard. Was Willard influenced by Mary Lyon, specifically regarding her home protection approach, where she kind of co-ops women's role in the domestic sphere as a reason for why they needed the vote. So kind of that same strategy of justifying expanding women's sphere through domestic rhetoric.
Okay. Question number one, did Mary Lyon know about the manual labor movement? Yes. So Oberlin, and I failed to mention this for Oberlin, Oberlin explicitly used the manual labor movement. The distinction between what's happening at Oberlin and what's happening at Mount Holyoke is that the manual labor movement was one of the many exciting reforms of the 19th century. It's such a fun century to study because everyone was into wild reforms. Was that part of education should be that you actually have physical training that's balancing your mind and your body, but it's also used to drive down the cost because you get paid for the manual labor you do, and it offsets some of the costs of your education. What's different, so Oberlin was doing that for men and women. Mount Holyoke wasn't paying the students. It's actually distinct. And Mary Lyon has in some of her letters that she's actively rejecting this approach because she actually thinks that it's not economically viable. She thinks it's actually way cheaper for the education to not pay the students, just have their labor obviate the need for hiring cooks, maids, et cetera. And so she makes an economic call that she thinks that that's not the way to do it. Also, she's less interested in the whole panoply of reforms. And I love Mary Lyon, but I want to be honest about her lack of perfection. And so she kept abolitionist activism out of Mount Holyoke, though she was sympathetic to it because she didn't want to divide Christians, because she considered it less important than evangelism. So straight up. But at the same way, she was not as into the whole panoply of reforms. She wasn't interested in manual labor for its own sake, its sort of academic benefits. And then she made a pragmatic call that she didn't think its financial benefits were as good the way it was done elsewhere and at Oberlin as it would be in the sort of new way she did it at Mount Holyoke. So that's the answer to number one. Number two, was Willard directly affected by Lyon? I admit I don't know directly, in the sense of I have not studied enough on Willard to have writings that detail this. That said, literally everyone in her sphere was affected by Mary Lyon and would cite her. And so when you go forward to someone like Madeline Southard, who was a women's preacher, the head of the International Association of Women's Preachers, I've been looking at her stuff lately, in the 1920s, she cites two inspirations, Frances Willard and Mary Lyon. So probably, but I don't want to go out. I'm not in that text right now. I can't say definitively. In terms of whether home protection, the idea that the very clever argument drawing on separate spheres that if women are supposed to be in charge of the home, but things in the city affect the home in terms of sanitation, in terms of what's going on in the streets when my kids go out there, therefore women should be involved in local politics. I don't think so, because again, Mary Lyon was doing that for pragmatic, not ideological reasons, incorporating domestic labor, but I wouldn't swear to it.
Yeah, it seems to me that Catherine Beecher would be a much more, who you didn't talk about today, but is part of this story and has a Midwestern pull and Willard's a connection. But Catherine Beecher is probably, we could establish more of a direct lineage, maybe just say a few words about her.
I have a whole other talk comparing Lyon and Beecher, but yes, Catherine Beecher was a women's pioneer in women's education. She was part of the Beecher clan, who were like the Kennedys of the 19th century, as I always tell my students, because all of them were famous. And so her father was a prohibitionist, or sorry, a temperance, famous minister. Henry Ward Beecher, famous liberal minister. Of course, Harriet Beecher Stowe, the most famous of them all, for writing Uncle Tom's Cabin. Her other sister was a suffragist. So it was everything. So, but Beecher didn't manage to establish like a permanent women's institution for reasons, but her vision was to professionalize women's work and make it very much like this is women's work. So she was the opposite. She'd pay her teachers a lot. It meant that not as many students could afford her institutions. And she had this vision that we're going to professionalize homemaking and nursing and teaching and pay them as much as being a businessman or a scientist. And so that women will do different things from men, but be on par. So it was a different sort of vision.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Our last question in the chat is just a very basic definition question about how would you define evangelical at this time?
Okay, great. So word changes meaning over time. It means, roughly speaking, I'm using it to mean revivalist Protestantism in the 19th century. So belief in a moment of conversion where a person repents of their sins and places faith in Christ for the forgiveness of those sins on the basis of his death and resurrection. In the 19th century, there's a lot of sort of, and then you don't worry about reform in the later 20th century. You do the separate sort of pietist thing. In the 19th century, it's like, as soon as you get saved, you go to work, right? Like you start going and reforming the world. And so that was a more common sense of evangelical than is true today. So the political connotations of that have changed radically over time. That said, there were variations, and I'm talking about a particular radical wing slice of that group. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and one of the things you start the book with is this idea that we really need to be looking at faith and religion in this time period to fully understand. And religious historians and women's historians especially haven't spent so much time. Maybe we could end with that, because when I read that, it struck me, one of the things about hanging out with Frances Willard, you cannot tell her story, because her faith is her activism, and her activism is her faith. They are inextricable. And that's something that we just don't maybe experience the same way. So I love that you start the book, that we really, this time period especially, we need to be looking at these two things for this such an important force in women's lives, in anyone's life at this time, and that we haven't done as much of that work as we probably should have in recent years in history. So I very much appreciated that focus in your book. So maybe we'll end there, and thank you so much, Andrea. This has been such fun and so interesting.
Thank you. Michael.
Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Thank you all for coming. I love talking about this. I find women who pushed the boundaries that were available to them because of their passion for other people, for making the world a better place as they understood it to be incredibly inspiring. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.